Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to the Truth Factor discussion. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing today? Let's start with you, Daniel.
I am doing wonderful, and I'll say it's morning here, and I hope that you all will grab your Bible and follow along with our study today. We welcome you all, and just let you know that we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 today, and we look forward to your comments and questions.
Very good. Good to see you now in an official office capacity type thing, or
Yeah.
Study area.
although I like the background of your living room, I thought it was, pretty peaceful, Paul, how are you doing?
Doing great, John, Tom, and Daniel. Good to see you guys and all those in our chat. If you sign into the chat, you can just click on guest and type your name, and it'll give you the ability to make comments and questions. We already, in fact, have some comments on our topic, and so it'll be interesting for us to, or on our section of Scripture, I should say. I was not able to be here last week. One of our members was having some surgery. Actually, it was a C-section to have a little baby girl, and she's beautiful. And I needed to be with the family, but I'm glad to be back this week. And I'll be gone next week because we have a gospel meeting here, and we're having daytime classes. And then after that, we have some other obligations as well as our evening services. So if you're in the Ellettsville area, we'll meet Sunday through Wednesday, our gospel meetings with Alan Yater.
Well, what we could do is just have you live stream it, and we'd pipe it through here, and then we would pause and talk about things that he said.
Well, you could do that.
I think you'll like Brother Yater. Rhonda, a couple years ago, she went up there to teach a class at one of the ladies' Bible class things that is held up in that area, and she got to visit with Brother Yater and his wife a good bit, and really enjoyed getting to meet them. So
I got to meet him in one of my first couple weeks in being in Indiana, and so he was really courteous and everything, and enjoyed getting him during that time.
Yeah. Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine out here. Looking forward to our study as always. Good to see Daniel back with us, and good to be a part of it. And glad you're able to be with us today, John. I know you've been dealing with some voice issues. But we will make it through the program. So looking forward to our study.
I'm not sure what happened. Ron and I were around a lot of cut grass on Friday and Saturday, both ourselves and here at the building and everything. And I don't know. Sometimes Saturday night, Sunday felt the cold coming on, or allergies, what we had thought. And by the time Sunday night, it was evident it was in my voice. And then yesterday, it was just bad. Today it's still weak sounding, but it's better than what it was yesterday. So
right.
That's
so
why
we'll try not to provoke you today.
What's that?
We'll try not to provoke you today.
Oh man, please don't do that. Yeah. But we'd like to thank you for joining us for our study today. It's good to be back. We'd like to thank Seth McDonald for joining us last week, filling in Paul's absence. He did a very fine job with that. Well, today we enter into 1 Corinthians chapter 11, technically starting with verse 2, only because verse 1 really belongs with chapter 10. Of course, you've known that. You've discovered that before in your studies and everything, where Paul closes it by saying, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." Now, there's something I think what we might want to discuss briefly, and as we go through the reading of this text, we can highlight the pros and the cons regarding this particular thought. And there's already been some talk about it there in the chat room. But 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is one of those hot topic chapters of the Scriptures. There's probably been more debates over the first half of it than there have been over the latter half of the chapter. The question that I'd like for us to kind of address at the outset is, what would be the arguments for and against saying that chapter 11 is talking about worship service practices, or saying that chapter 11, the first half of it, is strictly individual application and has no bearing whatsoever on worship service? I mean, do you think that's relevant enough to the context to talk about that for a couple of minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, we certainly can, because that factors into the interpretation of what is actually intended.
Okay, all right. Well, we've got a couple comments in the chat room. One definitely specifically we'll bring in here in just a moment. It's interesting when you back up through 1 Corinthians, clearly chapter 8 is not so much talking about the worship service. It's talking about individuals and not worshiping idols. It's okay to eat things offered to idols, but it's not okay to go into the worship service and eat things offered to idols. Right. And then in chapter 9, he builds upon his right as an evangelist to receive income. And so it seems to be very worship based. And then verse 10 seems to lay the foundation, which may hint towards a direction referencing the worship service, when he addresses the habit of some to eat from the table of the Lord and eat from the table of idols at the same time. Again, not establishing rules for worship services, but might point in that direction of that's where his concern seems to lie. And what they're doing while worshiping God, they also go over and worship idols in the temple of idols. And it's clear chapter 12 is talking about the exercising of miracles or miraculous gifts, but all of us being of the same body, no one being more important than the other. Let's give some examples of that. We would see that in chapter 14. Chapter 11 kind of building upon chapter 13, building upon the directions of 12 regarding our attitude as parts of the body working together. And then 15, he's dealing with the teaching of the resurrection, or some teaching there has been a resurrection. And then 16, he begins by addressing the collection of the saints on the first day of the week. So I don't know. I've kind of taken the position that all of 11 is a section beginning looking at elements or things that have to do with in the worship service. Randy in our chat room takes a little bit different standpoint of that. Let's go ahead and bring. Actually, I don't have it ready. Hang on just a moment. Let's bring in Randy's comment. Paul, going back to, I think if you take just the text. Oh, Paul's gone. Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Tom, I'll have you to do that.
Okay, and yeah, just a couple of comments, then we move on down. And yeah. I have a couple of observations too about what you said.
Sure.
Anyways, he makes a statement early on, and this was actually in some of our pre-program discussion or talking. He says, I think if you just take the text verse by verse, it is very easy. Yeah, you have to have an agenda to twist this to mean something it doesn't mean. Also, you have to understand the text in the context and time period of when it was written.
That's a good point.
And then he goes on and he says there the head covering part is not talking about the worship service. And I'm going to say something about that in just a second here. And then we scroll on down. Brian Haynes, I believe, is that where we're at?
I think so.
Okay, Brian Haynes, where he talks about the relevancy of the issue of context, whether it is in worship or not, speaks more to the intent of those who practice. Those who hold this only practice it in worship, and yet it seems to be something that is not a worship teaching. I would suggest it would suggest inconsistency in those who hold to it. And then he goes on and he talks about, again, Randall says, I think it is very important. If the first half is talking about the worship service, then Paul wastes his breath in chapter 14 after instructing women to pray and prophesy with their head covering if he tells them to be silent in chapter 14. Contextually, this doesn't make sense, so application-wise, it must apply to any time they are praying or prophesying outside of the assembly. And he also goes on to say, also, I think what brethren miss is the fact that whatever the man is doing, the woman is doing. They are not doing two different actions as some brethren teach. The woman is not listening to praying and prophesying. She is doing the praying and prophesying. And so we'll cover some of that as we go through it. But let me make this comment about your point as far as the transitioning in the text. in chapters 8 through 10, what I see in these chapters is Paul is dealing with the attitudes that brethren have to have toward one another. Even in dealing with idols, one of the big things he's dealing with is the conscience and offending your brethren. And of course, as we've discussed in the subject of offending, we don't mean you hurt my feelings. What we mean by that is being made to stumble. And you know, even dealing with chapter 10, for conscience sake, you know, if someone says this is offered to an idol, and it would obviously be somebody outside of the worship service, in that case, you don't partake of it because you might be lending to their acts of worship, and so I see attitudes that are important in our worship, but they're also important in our dealings with one another as brethren at all times. And I think that's the point. And when you deal with the last part of chapter 10, where he makes the distinction about you can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of idols, I think the point he's making there is, you know, we're a Christian at all times, and it's inconsistent to come together on Sunday and worship God and be all holy, and then the rest of the week be unholy.
Would it not hinge to some extent on whether you consider the transition from verses 16 to 17 a hard break or not?
It's in the original.
Because he says in verse 17 about when you come together, it's not for the better but for the worse, and he also puts that in context later on with the Lord's Supper in verse 20.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I see. And what, like I said, what I see in the first part of chapter 11, and I think this one of the things that's the challenge is, and as I describe it, is kind of a transition. We're in a transition area. Paul's dealing with attitudes, you know, in the way we treat each other as brethren, and the way we treat the world, you know, our example to the world and so on. And then you have this passage which clearly was, you know, we know from historical context that a lot of what was dealt with there had to do with the customs of the time. You know, I mean, and that's one of the things we have to factor in our discussion of this particular topic. But he's still dealing with, you know, men and women and attitudes which are going to be vital in understanding when we get to those things which we clearly know are the worship service.
And really, when you narrow it down more than, and I appreciate you pointing out attitudes, Tom, the attitude is that some had the attitude that all things are lawful. I'm a Christian, I'm free in Christ, I can do whatever I want. That's the attitude that he's mainly addressing in almost all the book of 1 Corinthians. And so he's continuing that theme in chapter 11 as we get into that, because evidently there's some women, for instance, who don't feel the necessity to wear a head covering when they pray or prophesy because they don't feel to be bound to that custom, you know, or you get to the Lord's Supper, there's people who don't feel the need to consider their brothers and sisters, they don't feel the need to take, you know, or let me say this, they feel free to get drunk, you know, during the Lord's Supper. And so just in general, the overlying theme that we're dealing with is people who have an attitude, who think they have a right to do things when they do not have the right to do them, or they have the right, but there's other things that they need to consider.
Yeah, whether or not it edifies, whether or not it is expedient, which we've already discussed.
Right.
Paul, you got any thoughts on it?
Well, I think as we look at this, we ought to keep in context and keep in mind that he's going to talk about many different things. He's going to not only talk about a physical covering, he's going to also talk about hair and length of hair. He's going to talk about men and women, and how we apply these principles are going to influence a great deal how we teach and how we understand those different things. And so just as we study together, I'll be very interested to examine that. But but I think we need to kind of not just pull one or two verses out of the context of the whole thing, but try to get the big picture.
Yeah. See, what makes me wonder, and I'm not dogmatic on saying it has to be the context in worship, dealing with worship service. It's just interesting that there were problems regarding this.
Oh yeah.
And and Mike Willis in his commentary, and I just reference it. I think it's Mike Willis in his commentary, suggests that at this time the Greek women were saying no, we don't have to cover our heads, and the Jewish women were saying you have to cover your heads, and it was in a situation where it was causing a lot of dissension and discord. That's where I kind of wonder if it was in a public setting that would bring about this contention, whereas privately in their homes wouldn't have been so contentious because it wouldn't have been made known necessarily. But now, again, why is it important? Well, if someone's going to believe the head covering is necessary, then understanding whether or not this is talking about the worship service would affect the way that they made the application of it within their lives. And I've known some women who in wearing the head covering only did it during worship. I've known others who any time they prayed, although I never saw any women prophesy, anytime they prayed they would have something on top of their head. But let's go ahead and read a couple of passages here within this. The context is kind of lengthy, running from chapter 2 down through verse 16. So let's plan to break this up a little bit here. And what do you think? Do you think verse 6 would probably be a good stopping point? Verse 7 steps into the discussion of why, what's the purpose of having something on his head and not, so forth.
Well, we don't pay any attention to that anyway, John, so you can go ahead and read through verse 6, and if we need to jump ahead to bring a point, we can do that.
All right. Well, Paul, I'm going to throw this to you if you would.
I'll be happy to read. Beginning at verse 2 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the scripture says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but a woman is the glory of man." And I read too far. I apologize.
Actually, go ahead and read through verse 9.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beginning there at verse 8, it says, "For man is not from woman, but woman from man, nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man."
All righty. Thank you, Paul. So let's back up then in the text to verse 2. Notice here he begins by saying, he says, "I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you." Now, typically, anytime an apostle uses the term tradition in reference to things that he's taught, he's not talking about customary traditional practices that are passed down without basis or merit, but instead he's talking about things that have been given to them by God. Now, in this case in point, do you think that's the same context?
Yeah, I think the point that Paul is making with traditions is when I think of the word tradition used in this particular sense, he's talking about fundamental teachings that come from God that the apostles have taught that we are expected to follow.
All right. What do you think, Daniel?
These are the thoughts that he is delivering from God. I think that's an accurate statement.
Okay. Isn't it in my brain is a little bit running not on 100% today. Isn't it in his Thessalonian letters that he makes reference to keeping the traditions that we have taught to you? I could do a quick search for that, I guess.
Yes, 2 Thessalonians 2:15.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And also 3:6, where he talks about you withdraw from those who walk disorderly and not according to the traditions which you received. So
that's it, yeah. So we're going to say it's our understanding, and if anyone in the chat room sees it to be different, I'd be happy to look at reasons why this word might be used in reference to customary practices. But I really believe the context here is talking about the teachings that they have already been given. So it is interesting in addressing the subject of the head covering and whether or not the women should have their head covered, and really whether or not the men should have their heads uncovered. All right, kind of as Randall pointed out a while ago, this is a passage that's dealing with both the same situation. It's not just about the women.
Right.
He begins this by talking about authority.
Yeah, absolutely. John, before you get too far into that, let me make one other observation about that traditions.
Yes.
What Paul has just emphasized is the importance of the proper attitude toward each other, as far as not causing your brother to stumble, being aware of the conscience, and so on. And I think that's kind of how he's tying this into this text here. When he starts talking about the man and the woman and the way and their interaction with others in society, so on and so forth.
Well, I think we're on the same page, Tom, because that's why when asked, is this tradition something given from God, I don't think God made head coverings for women to wear. That's not what I believe is the tradition Paul is passing down. But the principles that have been since the beginning of creation, and the principles of understanding that although you're free, there are certain restrictions that you should place on yourself because of the times and the culture and the people around you, that those would be the principles that God had given Paul to use, and we would see how they're applied in Paul's specific scenario to Corinth.
Right.
Okay. I tell you what, we've got a whole discussion going on in the chat room, and if we keep going much further, we're going to just completely miss a lot of those comments. So let's pause for a minute, having talked about verse 2. Let's bring some of the comments in, and then let's hit verses 3 and 4, or more verse 3, and see the primary point that Paul seems to be. And it goes back to what Daniel was talking about and what Tom. I think what we're looking at here, he says, here's the truth. Now, how does these things factor, or how does it affect these things? Maybe it would be a way of looking at that.
Exactly. Verse 3 is the principle.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm going to start with Randall's comment. I think we had read the previous two, where he says you will not find a Greek scholar. And so let me bring the screen share up for that. And Daniel, if you'll do some reading here, let's kind of take each one of these one at a time.
Okay. He says, you will not find a Greek scholar with any credibility that says that the woman is doing a different action than the man. I think this is the most significant point which ties this action to the spiritual gifts. This is talking about the spiritual gift of praying in an unknown tongue. 1 Corinthians 14:14, and the gift of prophecy, which are both gifts of the Holy Spirit given to both men and women and freely exercised by both men and women outside the assembly. Carl says it sounds like, I'm guessing AP is apostle?
Yes.
Okay. Apostle Paul is also educating us on how to look at outward showing of submission, whether cultures have changed or not. It also seems like he is saying how Christians should view women's hair length. So my statement is more of a question. Is Paul teaching a doctrine here? Do you want me to keep reading?
Yes and no. On one hand, we could talk about each one of the comments, but I think let's go ahead and read through them, and then we can back up and kind of address them as we go through the study here.
Sounds good. Within the assembly, this is Randall Duvall, women are not allowed to speak, so therefore they are not allowed to exercise any of the gifts. So the head covering within the assembly is a moot point. Brian says, I would think that the question of whether this is universal church doctrine is answered in verse 16. Randall Duvall says, the whole text hinges on verses 4 and 5. Are the men doing the same action as the women? If the answer is yes, then it is not in the assembly. If the answer is no, then you can fight it in the worship service. Josh Thornhill says, I may be wrong, but it appears that the head covering was to be used as the spiritual gifts were being used based on verses 4 and 5.
Okay.
Can I make a point just to maybe cover one of the more
Yeah.
of a clarification of what my dad's saying. I will say this, is that when we are looking at this letter as Paul wrote it, it's helpful for us to go in the order that it's written. Women are apparently speaking in the assembly with their spiritual gifts. So he's telling them first, if you're doing that or any time, in my opinion, you need to be covered. So he's not exclusively talking about outside the assembly in chapter 11 when he's getting there. But once you get to verse 14, or chapter 14, that's the application that you can make for today, having read through the letter. But just picture yourself as the Corinthians reading this through. They haven't got to chapter 14 yet. They're still on chapter 11. So this would apply to all scenarios at all times for them. And then later you would apply the principle of 1 Corinthians 14 to the restriction of the assembly. So that's just my view on that.
Okay, all right, that's good.
Because I don't think Paul specifically says this only applies to outside the assembly, and I don't think that's my dad's point either. But he's meshing our perspective, having gotten to read chapter 14 already. So.
Okay, and that'll give your dad a time to comment on that if he's. Yeah.
Sure.
Paul, you got any comments on any of our comments in the chat room before we kind of walk through this?
No, I think I'd prefer to take it a verse at a time and just walk on through like
All right.
like we normally do.
And there will, matter of fact, a couple things that have been stated in the chat room we'll definitely address as we go through this in the verse by verse fashion here. Bear with me a moment. I'm checking on one thing.
I did have a comment. You were talking about.
Yeah.
I said I didn't, and then of course I do because that's what preachers do. My understanding is that in verse 2, where it says, "I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions, just as I delivered them to you." It sounds like that there are at least some in our discussion who don't think that he's using that in the same sense that Paul spoke to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 15. I realize I was away for part of that discussion, but there he says, "Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistle." And so Paul there refers to the teaching that he had done as traditions.
And we reference that, so it's awesome that we're on the same page, brother.
Yeah. We established that.
Well, I'm sorry. I've had a couple distractions today and had to step away.
All right, Randall threw something in the chat room, and Randall, we haven't really talked about it yet.
We're working verse by verse.
Yeah, but I did reference what he said as being in agreement with it. He says, "You guys haven't answered my question. Are the men and women doing the same action?" And the point that I made a while ago is I agree that when he's talking through here, it's not just a passage about women wearing head coverings. It's about men not having a head covering on. It's addressing both men and women in their actions in regards to praying and prophesying, and how the teaching on authority directly affects the behavioral practices of those things.
Maybe I'm missing out somehow. I'm not sure I understand the question. When he asks, "Are men and women doing the same thing?" Is he talking about covering? Is he talking about praying and prophesying, worshiping?
Here, I'll explain. Is that there are many brothers and sisters who practice the head covering, or I'll say sisters, who practice the head covering, and what they do is they wear the head covering when they're listening to a prayer. They're not saying the prayer, they're listening to a prayer. And my dad's point is, in 1 Corinthians 11, it's not that the men are the ones leading the prayer, then when he talks about women, they're listening to it, that they are both the active leaders in these actions. And so that's the point he's trying to distinguish, that the man and the women are doing the same thing in this. It's not one is listening and one saying, they're both saying. They're both taking that act.
That was earlier in the chat discussion, Paul. A good bit early, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just for sake of clarification, in Acts chapter 21 and verse number 8, Paul he enters the house of Philip the evangelist, and it says here that he had 4 virgin daughters that prophesied. So there were women that did prophesy back in the first century. I do not believe that they prophesied in the assembly. I based on my understanding of 1 Corinthians 14, I believe that it would have been outside of the assembly, but yet they did have spiritual gifts. And I would think that the 1 Corinthians 11 would apply in that type of a circumstance. They acknowledge their subjection to man as they actively participate in prophesying and prayer, like Daniel said, as opposed to passively participating in prophesying or prayer.
Well, I think if you have prayer as uninspired prayer, what you have is an uneven pair here. You would, if you have just regular prayer, why not just regular teaching? Why isn't prayer and teaching there? No, it's prayer and prophesying. What is different about regular teaching versus prophesying? It's the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's the difference of those, the provoking of the Spirit. So the provoking of the Spirit is what distinguishes the prophesying from the regular teaching that a woman may do, or has the ability to do, let me say that. There's something different about that needs the covering. And the same would apply for the praying. She's not leading the prayer, but this is a Spirit speaking through her during that time.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about verse 3 for just a minute here now. He makes the point. He said, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. The way that he starts this, it sounds like everything that he's about to say is based upon this principle. Everything he's going to write is founded upon this principle. So we have every man, he says, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. That's a natural order. I say natural order of things. I don't know if that's quite the right word to use there, quite phrase. But this is the way that it is. The head of the man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now here's the question. Are we talking outside of the marital relationship, just in a general overview of all things? Or is, to me, contextually, this would be a general overview that somehow or another, in manner of speaking, just as God is head over Christ and Christ is head over man, man is head over the woman.
Exactly.
I think he's talking about the creation order of things. When he talks about, for instance, Adam was made, or Eve was made from Adam, and then he goes on to explain that all men come from women after that. And,
right.
I like my ESV, but I think it misses the mark by picking wife and husband here. I think he's talking about just men and women in general.
Yeah. And of course we realize that that's politically incorrect. But that doesn't change that it's what the Scripture says. And I mean, because this is dealing with what I would call God's spiritual order. And one point of observation in that is that he talks about how man, to a degree, is subject to. As far as the order goes here. So man needs to understand and learn subjection, just like the woman does.
And that's what we always want to put restrictions on the woman when she gets married. But the guy, if he wanted to go that way, it would be, could he wear a head covering before he got married? But now he can't wear a head covering when he does get married. I don't know many people who are arguing from the husband perspective. And I think when you include all the context, you get a better picture of what Paul is trying to say here.
All right. I'm not trying to open a can of worms, and I probably will here. So I guess my point is that we're looking at a general principle, not so much a principle of application. In other words, I have known some brethren, and I'm not being critical whatsoever. If this is one's own belief, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But I've known some brethren who believes that a woman can't hold a political office, can't be PTA president. because the woman is not supposed to be head over the man. The man is head over the woman. Is it a statement of truth to be applied in that, or is it simply statement of fact, not necessarily seen within the action until you begin to define the husband and wife relationship and our subservience to Christ and Christ doing the will of God? Does that make sense? Okay, that's what I guess one of my questions is. This more of a generalized statement, not intended to affect anything necessarily within our lives, but more a statement of truth, almost like what Daniel said. God didn't create Christ, obviously, but Christ submitted to the will of his Father, and Godhead created man, and then they created woman, and woman is being subjection to man within the context of a marital relationship for sure, but in the general order of things.
Right. Yeah, and Randall actually brings up a verse, in our comments.
Yes.
He actually has a couple more comments here that.
I want to start with Randall of Randall's comment there in 1 Timothy 2, because I think that is a good passage that we can bring into factoring with what we're looking at here in verse 3.
Right.
John, is your question before, was it like, could a woman run for president of the United States? Could you work for a woman boss who was over you?
Yeah. The application of that passage, would it rule out a woman boss? Would it rule out a woman president? Or is it just a general statement of the principle of the issue, not necessarily delegated and not necessarily applied within life, unless there's a teaching that hinges upon that, like the husband-wife relationship, like what we're looking at here.
And I would put it this way: does it apply in all aspects of life, or does it apply in spiritual aspects? And when I say spiritual aspects, that goes above and beyond when we assemble together. It also involves it involves the husband-wife relationship. We have spiritual responsibilities and so on.
Go ahead and read Randall's comment there, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to do that right here. So, anyways, he goes ahead and he says here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control.
All right, so then read his next comment real quick.
Okay, he goes on and he says, this is stating biblical principles. This is stating biblical principles, not societal principles, because Christ is not the head of the non-Christian world. He is the head of the body. So I think this applies to the relationship within the body of Christ, not societal norms. And that's the point that I would make. But of course, the one point we keep in mind, though, is that you're a Christian at all times.
Well, and that I would have to ask the question: is verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 11, is that limited to only people within the body of Christ, or is that a general principle?
No, I think, okay, although 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy chapter 2 appeal to the created order, I think there's indications in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that it's talking about the religious practice principles that are being applied.
Yeah,
and
I agree with that. Yeah.
And so even too in 1 Corinthians 11, you see his application as to these religious principles of the praying and the prophesying and the spirit working and that. But in 1 Corinthians 11, it seems like a little more broad context with the head covering in the sense that this was something too that was just a sign of authority all the time, whether you're actually participating in a religious action or not. So to me, 1 Corinthians 11 seems a little more broader than 1 Timothy 2, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of the point that I'm making, is that with 1 Corinthians 11:3, and I hadn't worded it this way, I think that's a general broad-based principle for creation, whereas what Randall's brought up, 1 Timothy 2, would definitely be limited to the functioning and worship of the local congregation.
Right.
And I think the key word there is teach And I don't think many people would take the position that teach there is teach somebody anything, that a
Right.
woman could never teach a man anything,
Right.
but that this is the religious setting of her being the teacher over the man.
Yeah, teach over
AKA
or
Henry.
exercise authority over.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And, yeah. Exactly. And you might even add to that the man who is a believer and so on, because I mean, if you've got a circumstance where a woman needs to teach an unbelieving man and she's the
Yeah.
only option he has,
Well,
you know.
Priscilla and Aquila.
What's that?
Priscilla and Aquila.
Yeah. And see, but the observation that I would make with the 1 Corinthians 11, you know, you made the point about you're asking, is it to believers or unbelievers? It's irrelevant where unbelievers are concerned because they don't care. You know, unless you live in a society, and I'm going to give an example of radical Islam, where you get into the countries where women are forced into wearing the veils or whatever, regardless of their religious beliefs in that society. And I mean, and they make it a point of issue where everybody's going to do it just because they are there. You know, here I think the point that Paul is making is, you know, I mean, obviously it's Christians that understand this authority and this objection. Now, Corinth apparently had some standards or traditions or whatever you want to describe in that culture where this became a part of the culture, and depending on your head covering, your head shaved or so on, meant certain things within the city. And I think that's a part of what Paul is addressing here.
All right. Paul, any thoughts or comments about what Paul was addressing here?
Well, I was just typing you guys a little note that I've got a variety of distractions here today, and if I appear distracted, because I am, and there are important things that I've had to try to manage along with our study, and I apologize for that. I do think that there are spiritual principles concerned here. And I appreciated earlier, I was listening as intently as I could to Daniel's clarification on the fact of whether this was dealing with the, and whether Randall was representing that this was dealing with the assembly or strictly outside of the assembly. And I think I got a better handle on that. But I'll continue to study through with us. This is... maybe this isn't the right time to say this, but I will say that I do know brethren who are very convicted that, or sisters that are very convicted that they need to wear this covering in any kind of a worship assembly. And as long as there's not a point of contention or divisiveness or enforcing that upon everyone in that assembly, I don't try to prohibit her from doing what she thinks that she needs to do.
Not only that, if she believes it's necessary, she needs to do it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know a preacher years ago, a long time ago, an older preacher who, this young new convert, young mother, was really struggling over this, and she went up to him and said, you know, do I have to wear this? What do I need to know about this? He goes, oh, that's stupid. You don't have to worry about that. And walked away.
Yeah,
and she felt
wrong attitude.
Yeah, I mean, she wanted to genuinely study the issue and to be able to properly understand it.
Yeah, and I don't say that, by the way. I don't say that, by the way, as a cop-out to say, oh, well, you know, if she wants to, do it. If she doesn't, you know, don't. I don't mean it that way at all. I just mean that if there's someone who, for whatever reason, this is something they really are struggling with, I don't ask ladies to wear that, my wife or any other ladies. But I certainly don't have an objection. It's not a distraction to me or anything else if the ladies decide they want to wear it. But I'm not just throwing out there, well, you know, whatever, you know, we ought to study to know the truth.
Sure. And I don't think I think we need to be wary though of making a general principle based on our living situations. What Paul is advising here is adhering to the social norms and understanding of society. in this society, there was some, at least in the world, who viewed these head coverings as a sign of submission. Now, I have no problem with a woman wearing a head covering if she's convicted, because that doesn't mean anything in our society. Now, if our society said wearing a doily on your head meant you were a rebellious prostitute, then even if somebody was convicted in doing that, I would advise them not to do it, because the society would tell them that that means something different than what they intended to mean. And so we do need to listen to society and see what kind of perspective we're giving off, because although we realize that we're free and that all things may be lawful to us is what we think, we need to learn what is expedient and what's going to be helpful to society. So for our society, though, yes, I have no problem with a woman who's convicted in that and wants to wear a head covering. But if for some reason society changed and wearing a head covering was a negative sign of rebellion, then maybe we would advise against that.
Okay. All right. All right. Let's see. All right, I'm trying to looking in the chat room to see, because we need to get on to verse 4 actually here in just a moment. Let me and you know what, Paul has got the switching on automatic because he's having to step away and attend with other things, so that means that I'll need to do all the reading so that it will stay up on the screen. I'm gonna start with Randall's comments, where he agrees with Daniel, or he says, I agree, Daniel, this is relationship within the church. However, as Christians, we need to conduct ourselves with modest humility and propriety as we interact with society. And I think that's a very good point. Mm-hmm. Put it this way, let's say if some of our godly Christian ladies today, in their modest attire today, were to travel back in the early 1900s, they might be viewed as immodest, just because of the standard back then. I mean, there was a time women didn't wear pants in general. I mean, at least women of good report. And so if you had a woman of today travel back in time, she would have to dress the way that they dressed then, so as not to be an offense with that. Randall says, good point, Tom. That was something you made several minutes ago, but it's still a good point. Let's start with, I've lost the screen share. Sorry about that. All right, Brian, he says, question to the other end of this. Do we attend congregations that request men to remove their hats in the assembly? Would this be an example of a cultural practice brought into the assembly?
And I was thinking about that as I was preparing for this. I assume that that's tied to the women with head coverings, that men remove their hats. We do that out of respect. We take our hat off when we enter a building. Sometimes, not everybody does that when they enter a building, but a lot of people, when they pray, they'll take their hat off as they pray. And I would assume that it goes back to this same text. And I think the consistency is an interesting observation. I've always done it just out of tradition. Of course, I don't wear that many hats, so it's not that big of an issue. So.
And that's a great example, though, because yeah. I think it's also one of the examples that seems to be changing, where maybe when my grandpa was little, that you would get shot if you didn't take your hat off, to where in my day, my age group could care less whether you keep your hat on or not.
And even in worship.
Yeah, and I'm sure it varies from state to state, side of the United States to side of the United States, and so learn what the customs are, in the sense that if you are in a congregation where that is a huge sign of disrespect, make sure you do the things that make people know that you do have respect and that you have no problem with submission to the authority, etc.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think it's at least consistent with the view here about having his head covered or not. Struggle a little bit with that one, but I think that is because I had wondered when we got to that. I was hoping to talk about that as well. whether that was going to be consistent as well, whether a man ought to remove his hat. And we do see that the cultural norm, Tom, has changed. I think it used to be disrespectful to even walk in a building
Yes.
with a hat on, that you would see men remove their hat as they entered. And
or when you shook a woman's hand or something like that.
all kinds of things. And there are some, we would have some here who would still, I remember when I met my in-laws, my wife said, I would often wear a ball cap and say, well, take off, you'll want to take your hat off, or Dad will ask you to take it off in the house. And I never thought anything about it. So we see there's a change there. I'm not sure if there's a societal change or a scriptural practice that ought to be thought about in regard to having your head covered. I mean, I see the flag coming, I take my hat off, and I would ask a man in our assembly, I guess, if he was wearing a hat, to please remove it.
Yeah, I believe that it stands or falls with the women's head being covered. I'm talking about as binding. However, I will tell you this: I was raised to take my hat off, and that's not going to change the rest of my life. I mean, it's just a form of habit. I'll take my hat off when I pray. I'll take my hat off when I salute the flag or say the Pledge of Allegiance, out of respect. Typically when I go into a building, you remove the hat. I mean, it's just something that I do. It's a habit that I've developed, and I don't see a need to change it myself. Of course, the question that we're dealing with here, and this goes back to everything, is do we bind it?
I do know a brother who was in Russia, who approached the tomb of Lenin, and he was reminded to take his hat off with a rifle from a Russian soldier, removing his hat with his bayonet.
Yes.
And that does no great scriptural point there. I just thought it was a neat story. So.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions too that we don't understand all the factors that are actually going on in Corinth concerning the head covering. But you can see a principle that Paul is trying to lay down to promote unity within the congregation, because evidently there's some that may were being contentious, or Paul knew there were people who were going to be contentious about these things. And so he's trying to get them all on the same page. And so that's what I would advise is the congregation in and of itself should be on the same page. And here, if you're in a custom where, the head covering is a sign of submission and half the women have it on and half the women don't, then people are going in and going, okay, so half the women here are submissive to, and half the women are rebellious women. It shows a disunity, if you will. And so being on the same page as a congregation, I think, can be helpful in just showing your unity to people who would observe.
I'd like for us to discuss, I'm probably not going to be here next week, but I can always watch it at a later date. I'd like for us to discuss whether, as we look at this, whether Paul is making a statement about godly women and godly men and the length of their hair.
Yeah.
Well, we can do that.
I'll say this right now, Paul. I think you're safe.
If we try to stick to the verse by verse discussion, we've got a couple more comments, guys, and let me go bring them in real quick, and then we'll have to wrap this up. I don't think I started us off well enough. We've not done a good job today of sticking to verse by verse examination, but this is one of those topics everybody's already studied a lot of, and so there's already a lot of thoughts, and let's go ahead and throw them all out there at the beginning of the study, and that's kind of what has happened today. Right. Not really giving us a chance to touch the verse by verse.
Yeah.
However,
I was going to say, when we go through the verse we can go by the verse by verse next week, understanding all these things have been discussed.
It won't change. It'll still happen again next week. We'll just have to be a little more insistent on it, including with ourselves.
Right.
Let me go ahead and bring in the rest of the chat. And Randall says, Paul, I think all of us on the panel agrees with allowing a woman's personal convictions to wear head covering and should be honored as long as she doesn't try to bind it. But there's a truth to this passage, and that is what we're trying to factor on this program. Carl says, I was trying to think, is there any other type of instructions that is based on cultural practices? Could it be the holy kiss or feet washing? Randall says, those are excellent examples, Carl. Carl says, removing your hat is still today a sign of respect.
Yes.
Try wearing one in the courtroom. And Randall says, some churches require you to wear a tie if you serve on the table. It's their custom. If I go there and I need to wear a tie, I wear a tie and not be contentious.
Yeah, and I was actually going to make that observation, and when I made the point I did about taking my hat off, it's what I've always done and I always will do. The same thing is true when I preach on Sundays. I always wear a coat and tie. I mean, I honestly would not feel comfortable without that. Is it wrong? Absolutely not. You know, I'm saying to not wear a coat and tie? Absolutely not. It's where you're at. That type of, but for me personally, it's, you know, I would not feel uncomfortable. I would feel uncomfortable without it, if that makes sense, at least here, you know. But
all right.
I'm not going to buy, but we have no such tradition.
Yeah,
Well,
and
and
we'll
I
talk
think
about that in about 5 weeks when we hit verse 16, I think.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead because there's not much more to say other than just general ramblings about the passage and what we think about it. We'll plan next week to pick up with verse 3 and kind of look at each verse by verse. I mean, some things we want to talk about specifically, praying or prophesying. You know, although there's been some general discussion about it, we'll talk about what it means to cover the head. We'll talk about the Greek word there a little bit. Talk about Paul's question and everything. Someone put a comment in the chat room, and I guess I overlooked it about Carl and Paul not having to worry, not being follically challenged or being follically challenged or something like that. So anyway, any other final thoughts or comments? Let's start with you, Daniel.
Ramble, ramble, ramble. So that'll be my comment.
Yeah. Let's see. How are things going in Hawaii, though?
Wonderful. Just been running around, been really busy, and I like that. Certainly putting me to work. That's not something they're holding back. But we've had about, you know, in the 2 months I've been here, we've had about 30 visitors from the community who have been here, and much of them are Christians, you know, maybe some out of duty, others attending, you know, different congregations because of various reasons. And looks like we're even going to have 2 place membership with us because of just problems they had with the previous preacher that is no longer present here. And so just wonderful things happening. And also it's a pleasure to just get to see everybody who visits. We've probably had another 30 or 40 people visit in the 2 months that I've been here, just because people come into Hawaii. So it's been a great adventure. I think I've got about everybody's name down. That's something when you move to a new congregation, and so starting to get a routine. As you can see, I finally got my desk here, and so that's made work a lot easier. Overall,
how many members there are natives of Hawaii?
Like as far as born here and raised.
Yeah, I mean, it would be Hawaiian by
Yeah,
Islanders.
Sure. You know, maybe out of about the 60 just consistent members that we have, I'd say maybe 35 are native to Hawaii, somewhere around that. Have been here for a while.
Yeah. All right. Pretty sharp. All right, Paul. Any other thoughts or comments from you?
Nothing significant. I do want to apologize to our group, both the 3 of you, and those who joined us today. We had some workers here, and a family matter I had to attend to, and Bible class teacher who needed help because she didn't have the right material for tonight, and just was distracted on many different levels, and I apologize for that. I'll try to work those things out in advance before so that I can be more focused on our study during this hour.
That's fine, Paul. I understand that happens to all of us. Tom, any other thoughts?
Yeah. I would say to Paul personally, it's no problem because we're doing this study in the middle of the day, which means we're we're dealing with things, and that's why all of us are not able to be here every single week. So we kind of deal with it as we have to deal with it. And I'm thankful to be a part of it. I'm here in California, not quite as early as Daniel, but it's still the start of the day. And I can't think of a better way to start the day on the West Coast here than a study of this nature. So I thank everybody for your comments, and I'm honored to be a part of this study, and I look forward to next week.
All righty.
John?
All right. If you want to contact us, look at our lower thirds there. You'll see our name followed by @truthfactor.com would probably be the easiest way of contacting us individually. You can also send any questions and comments to questions@truthfactor.com. Questions, plural, @truthfactor.com. Thank you so much, and Lord willing, we'll continue next Wednesday, continue covering this subject, beginning at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's noon Eastern Time.
9 o'clock Pacific Time.
And 6 a.m. Hawaii time.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.